Hey guys, welcome to another video from the Forum for Learning, and specifically welcome to Lecture 1, Part 1 of the Biology 101 series of videos. In this video, we're going to try and answer these two questions here. So number one, what is biology? And number two, what constitutes life? And so Lecture 1, both part 1 and part 2, we're just gonna attempt to kind of give you guys an overview of biology, like, so what is biology, and sort of how is biology organized, and just a general overview of what's to come in the following lectures. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So like we said before, number one, what is biology? Right? So if we take the word biology apart, right, into its prefix and suffix, so the prefix being bio and the suffix being ology, and we define these two, we'll get a better idea as to what biology is. So bio simply just means life, right? And ology simply just means the study of, right? So for example, astrology or theology, right? So all of these ologies are just the study of. So what is biology? So based on just the definitions of the prefix and suffix of the word, it's simply the study of life, right? So that's essentially what biology is. And so, okay, so our next question is, if biology is the study of life, well then, what constitutes life, right? So what is life? Well, let's answer that. So what constitutes life, right? So, and this seems like a kind of a, I guess, so it's difficult to define it in that sense, right? So what constitutes life? But for example, if we say, a flower versus a rock, right? It's easy to say, oh yeah, the flower will be considered life, whereas the rock is non-living, right? Or not life, living, right? Oops. Okay, well, things are not always that easy, right? It's not always that easy to distinguish between something that's living and something that's non-living. So for example, bacteria versus viruses, right? Here, well, bacteria are considered living things, whereas viruses are considered non-living. And so here that distinction is a bit harder to draw, right? So again, we ask ourselves what constitutes life. And so biologists have sort of, pondered this for, many years, and what they've come up with is that they state that well, the answer to this anyway, or like the closest we're going to get to it, is that all living things share 8 characteristics. 8 characteristics / functions. So in other words, in order to be considered living, right, just like bacteria is considered living, or flower is considered to be living, so in order to be considered living, it has to have or possess these 8 characteristics or functions. So what are they? Well, let's go through them. So number one is order. So what we'll do is we'll just list them first, and then we'll discuss each of them, so that we spend enough time talking about each of those, each of these characteristics. So number two is the ability to sense and respond to stimuli. Number 3 is the ability to maintain homeostasis. Number 4 is the ability to harness energy. Number 5 is the ability to grow and develop. Number 6 is the ability to reproduce. Number 7 is the ability to evolve. Number 8 is the ability to adapt. Okay, so these are sort of those the 8 characteristics that all living things share. All right, so now if you look at these 8, you'll see that the first 5 of these characteristics or functions aid in individual survival, right? Meaning they aid in the survival of a single unit, so a single person or a single organism, right? So for example, the ability to harness energy, right? In order for us to survive, harnessing energy aids in the survival of the individual. Whereas if you look at these 3 guys here, these 3 characteristics aid in species survival. Right? So, and that's sort of how we'll organize part 1 and part 2 of lecture 1. So in the first part, so in this video, we'll cover the first 5 of the characteristics that all living things share. So this is going to be part 1, and then we'll talk about the remaining 3 in part 2. Okay, so let's get started with the first part, or the first 5. All right, so let's talk about number 1, order. So what do we mean by order, right? So when we talk about order, we mean that all living things have some form of organizational structure. Right, so which means kind of they have some sort of order with which they're organized, they're built, right? So for example, let's look at us, right? Let's look at humans. Right, so we are multicellular. Right, we're multicellular creatures. So let's look at how we are structured, or the organizational structure that we have as multicellular creatures. Oh wait, actually, let's finish. So yeah, order. Just when we talk about order, we mean that all living things have some form of organizational structure or order, consisting of, I forgot to mention this, consisting of one or more cells. Okay, and that's why I mentioned we're multicellular. So we're talking about the organisms that have more than one cell. So let's look at our organizational structure, right? So first we have the individual. So we have the human being. Right now, actually, let's do individual, because this also applies to other multicellular creatures. So we have the individual, which in this case is our human, right? So like you or I. And then if we can break the individual, we can break the human down into organ systems, right? So for example, we have the digestive system, right? And the organ systems are made up of organs. So multiple organs, they coordinate together to form the organ systems of the human body. And so, for example, an organ would be the liver, the pancreas, and so on and so forth, right? And then these organs are made up of what are called tissues. So for example, we have epithelial tissue, you could have connective tissue, and so on, right? And then these tissues, you can break these tissues down into cells, right? So different cells. So you have like the neurons, which are your brain cells, you have your hepatocytes, which are your liver cells, and then so on and so forth. And so, as you can see, to get from the cell to the individual, there's a whole lot of organized structure, right? It doesn't just go cell to individual, it goes cell, then to tissues, then to organs, and then organ systems, and then finally we make up the individual. So you can see that there's a great deal of a structure when it comes to human beings, right? And this is the case for all living things. Now, all living things aren't going to have, this level of structure, right? This complex of a structure, but all living things will have some form of organizational structure, either consisting of one or more than one cell. So let's look at an example of a unicellular organism and how a unicellular organism is structured, right? So for example, if we look at bacteria, so bacteria are an example of unicellular creatures. So let's put that in parentheses, right? So here we start with the cell, right? The cell is the biggest component, or the cell is the individual, right? So here, let's do that actually. So the individual here is a cell, because for unicellular organisms you only have one cell, right? So the cell is the whole organism. So well, actually let's write it the other way, because the cell is the individual, right? So now the cell can be broken down into organelles, right? And this is kind of similar to organ systems in that there's compartmentalization of structure and of function, right? So for the organ systems, for example, the digestive system takes care of digestion, right? It's not, of course they're all tied in, but it's not responsible for, say, getting oxygen into the blood, right? That's the task of the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary system, right? So you can see that there's compartmentalization of labor or of function, right? And the same thing goes for organelles in unicellular individuals. So for example, organelles, like we have mitochondria, right? Which is responsible for producing the energy that the cell needs, right? The other organelles don't do that, right? So, and then you have, for example, ribosomes, which are tasked with protein production, right? So you can see that even though we're looking at it from a much smaller perspective, right, you still have a great deal of organization, and very similar in terms of organizational structure, because you have, again, compartmentalization. Just like the organ systems of the human body, the organelles, the cells, also help compartmentalize function and labor, right? So now if you break down the organelles even further, we have what are known as macromolecules. So these are your proteins, your lipids, and your carbohydrates. Okay, then these macromolecules, so these are large organic molecules, right? So when you break down these large organic molecules, you'll end up with what are known as monomers. And monomers are just individual units of, or individual building blocks of these macromolecules, right? So you have the monomers, and so for example, so for proteins, if you break down proteins, you get what are known as amino acids. For lipids, those are fatty acids. And then for carbohydrates, they're known as monosaccharides. Right? Then if you break down the monomers, we end up with individual atoms. Right? Like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on and so forth, right? Oops. So, as you can see, even within a unicellular organism, you still have a tremendous amount of organizational structure, right? Because you have to go from the atoms, the monomers, the macromolecules, the organelles, and then finally you have the cell. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about a multicellular organism, right, we have, again, we go from the individual, and then you can break the individual down into organ systems. So the human being, you can break them down into the various organ systems, and the organs, tissues, and the cells. And then from here, you can break it down even further, right? Just like we did for the unicellular. So from the cell, you have the organelles, macromolecules, and then it keeps going on and on and on. So we're very complex creatures, and all living things have some some semblance of complexity and organizational structure. So that's very important. Now, the other two things that I want to mention real quick is that the cell, right here, which is our smallest kind of, well, you can break it down smaller, obviously, as we saw here, but the cell is actually the smallest form of life. And what I mean by that is it's the fundamental unit of life. Right? Now, that's very important because just like, so for example, monomers, right? If you build up the monomers, you get to macromolecules. Same thing with the cells are the building blocks of life, right? It's the fundamental unit of life. So that's very important. Now the other thing is atoms are the fundamental unit of matter. Oops. So there's a distinction there. So in order for it to be something to be considered living, it has to be made up of cells. But in order for something to be considered matter, it has to be made up of atoms, right? So that's the distinction between a cell, which is, I guess, the smallest unit we're talking about with respect to this diagram here, and then versus the atom, which is the smallest unit in this diagram, in this diagram here, right? So that was just a distinction that I wanted to make. All right, so now we've covered order. So now let's go to number 2, which is the ability to sense and respond to stimuli or stimulus, right? And we'll go with stimuli. All right, so what do we mean by this? Well, the ability to sense and respond, right? Like we mentioned before, just like the other 5 or the other 4 that we'll mention, is that this ability or this characteristic or this function that all living things share aid in survival of the individual. right? And so with respect to us, or with respect to, all organisms, the ability to sense, right? The ability to sense where in our case are the senses, right? Gives us, or gives the organism, the ability, the ability to understand what's happening in its environment, right? So by sensing a stimulus, you're also sort of mapping out or figuring out what's going on in the surroundings or in the environment that you're in, right? And that's very important because it gives us a sense of what's happening outside of the organism, right? And by understanding the environment and what's going on in the environment, we're then able to respond, right? Or react to a stimulus. And this response can be either positive, so it can be a positive response, or it can be a negative response, right? And now what do we mean by that? Well, when we say it's a positive, so let's say you sense a stimulus, right? An organism senses a stimulus, and then it responds positively. That just means that it moves towards stimulus. And if it reacts negatively, it just means that it moves away. Right, towards the stimulus, and here it moves away from the stimulus. So let's talk about an example, right? We'll talk about an example. So again, with respect to humans, we'll talk about it with respect to humans and why disability is so important, and sort of just give an example of what we mean by this. So for example, let's say that one day you touch a hot pan, right? What usually happens? Well, you're gonna pull your hand away, right? If you touch something that's hot, you're likely going to pull hand away, right? So there's two things happening here. When we touch, this is where our senses come into play, right? So we sense the heat, right? And then what do? We pull away, and so we react or respond negatively, right? And it's very important that we do that for our own safety, right? So this again goes to show how the ability to sense and respond aids in the survival of the individual, right? It protects us, because if we come in contact with a stimulus that can be potentially harmful, like touching a hot pan, we can respond in a way that we can get away from it, and so that we don't actually end up getting hurt, and so the stimulus doesn't actually hurt us, right? So another example would be to look at something. So for example, other than human beings, so let's look at something like plants, right? So plants, if you've noticed, or what they do is they move towards the source of light. It's actually really cool. You guys could try it at home, where if you have any indoor plants, if you try and put them by like a windowsill, you can notice that they'll start to sort of grow towards where that sun is coming from, towards the window, like the outside of the window. It's actually really interesting. And so this shows us that they're able to sense it, right? Because in order for them to move towards the light, they have to be able to sense the light. So they can not only sense the source of light, but they also respond. They respond, in this case, they respond positively, right? Because they're moving towards the stimulus, which is the source of light. So that's just another example. Now, bacteria are also known to do this in what are called, let's try a line here, in what are called, let's just do bacteria, what are known as chemotaxis. Chemotaxis and or phototaxis. And this is what happens when bacteria will move towards, so again, reacting positively, move towards a chemical source or light source, respectively. So hopefully that gives you guys a couple of examples of what we mean by having the ability to sense and respond to stimuli. Okay, so now let's look at the next one, which was, what did we say it was? We said that, so we did order, we just did the ability to sense and respond to stimuli, and now we're going to do the ability to maintain homeostasis. So, okay, so this is actually really important as well. Homeostasis. Okay. So again, this is another one of those characteristics or functions that aids in survival. Survival of the individual. Right. But let's first define what homeostasis is, right? So homeostasis is the maintenance of internal conditions within a narrow range, almost constantly. Right? Despite changes in external environment. So for example, some of the examples, so some of the things that our body tries to maintain, right, is temperature, pH, salinity, which is the salt concentration, blood sugar, right, and so on and so forth. Now, the purpose of homeostasis is to pretty much make sure that the cells within the body can function optimally, right? So that the conditions within the cell and within the body are conducive for optimal cellular activity, right? So that's pretty much what homeostasis is mainly for. It's to ensure that cells function optimally. So something that's very important, which we'll get to in the later lectures, are called enzymes, right? So enzymes, they're just proteins that are useful for metabolism, right? They're reaction catalysts, right? Metabolic reaction catalysts. And something about enzymes is that they require, so different enzymes, right? So different enzymes require their own set of conditions for optimal catalyzation of reactions. Right? So for example, a good example is pepsin, right? So pepsin is an enzyme that's found in the stomach, right? So enzyme that's found in the stomach. And what it does is it helps break down certain proteins in our diet, and it requires, pepsin is very interesting because it's located in the stomach, and one of the main reasons why it's located in the stomach is because pepsin requires requires an acidic environment. So a really low pH, right? So low pH. So it's something like around 2, which is really acidic. And so pepsin will only function, or can only function optimally when the pH is around 2. And so that's just another example of why homeostasis is so important. So now let's look at one example of how our body, so again, this is with respect to humans, how our body maintains homeostasis with respect to temperature. And so this is known as thermoregulation, right? So what is thermoregulation? Well, it's just, again, it's homeostasis, which is the maintenance of internal conditions within a narrow range almost constantly despite changes in external temperature or external environment. But thermoregulation is with respect to temperature, so internal temperature, right? So internal temperature. So it's to regulate internal temperature. So our bodies are usually around 36.5 degrees to 37 degrees Celsius, right? That's the narrow range that our bodies aim to keep the body temperature at, right? So what happens when it dips below or when it goes up? So for example, let's say that you're in Alaska, right? In the middle of winter. So in the dead of winter, you're in Alaska. So it's really cold. So what's going to happen? Your body temperature is going to start dropping, right? It's going to start dropping below that 36.5 degree to 37 degree range. And so we don't want that, right? Because again, we have to maintain our body temperature within this specific range so that our cells can function properly, so that our enzymes can function properly, and so on and so forth. So how do we, what does the body do, right? So it attempts to increase the body temperature, right? To get it back to this range here. And so how do you do that? So first of all, what happens? Well, what happens when we get cold? We shiver, right? That's one of the things. Another thing that happens, which we don't really, we can't really feel ourselves, is something that happens really without our control, is vasoconstriction of the vessels, so blood vessels in the extremities. So what happens is that your blood vessels will close up. So your blood vessels in your feet and your hands will close up and get narrower and allow less blood to the extremities in order to preserve warm blood for your core, right? Because majority of heat exchange happens in your extremities, so the body tries to limit the amount of blood that goes to the extremities, so you try and limit the amount of heat that is being dissipated. And so by doing both, by shivering as well as vasoconstriction of the extremities, of the vessels in the extremities, what happens? Your body temperature starts to go back up to be within the proper range, right? And so this is just an example, one of the examples of thermoregulation. And so let's look at the opposite. So let's look at what happens if let's say we were in Death Valley in the dead of summer. Well, here our body temp is likely going to be greater than 37 degrees, right? So greater than that, than this range here, than this range right here. And so what's going to happen? Well, what's the common thing when we get too hot? We start to sweat, right? So your body starts producing sweat and attempts to cool you down through evaporative cooling. The other thing that happens is the opposite of vasoconstriction. You have vasodilation of the vessels in your extremities. And so this allows for greater heat exchange and so greater heat dissipation. And again, the result is the opposite in that your body temperature will drop and to be within the proper range. And the body has systems just like this for all of those conditions that we mentioned before, for pH, for salinity, for blood sugar, and then so on and so forth, right? So this is just one example with respect to temperature as to how we maintain homeostasis and why it's so important. Again, it's to ensure that cells can function optimally regardless of changes in the external environment, because the body attempts to maintain those internal conditions of temperature, pH, salinity, blood sugar, and so on within a narrow range. And that's, again, it's within a narrow range, right? It's not just a specific number. It's usually within a narrow range because there has to be some buffering or some buffer for changes in the external environment. So that was homeostasis. So now let's look at our next one. So what's number 4, right? So number 4, what did we say it was? It was the ability to harness energy. The ability to harness energy, right? Okay. So why is this necessary, and what do we mean by this? Well, again, this is one of those functions or one of those characteristics that aid in survival, right? Individual survival, I should say, survival of the individual. Okay. So why do we need energy? Well, so let's look at an example, right? So what happens when you don't eat food? Let's say you're used to eating 3 meals a day, and then one day you decide to fast, right? What's going to happen if you haven't eaten anything and your body is used to consuming energy, right, in the form of food? What's going to happen? You're going to get lethargic, or you're going to get tired, and you're going to get you're not going to get anything done that day, right? Because you're just tired because you don't have enough energy, and that's something that you don't want, right? So the reason that we have to have the ability to harness energy is that without energy, right? Without energy, we can't carry out our other 7 functions, right? So without having energy, if you don't have energy, you can't really do anything else, right? Except maybe order. Yeah, okay, order is just, I guess, genetic, right? Because it comes, it's already established when you're born, but everything else is pretty much dependent on the ability to use energy, right? Or at least the characteristics that are involved in survival of the individual, right? So energy is very important. Now, the sources of energy, the sources of energy will vary depending on the organism. Right? So for example, let's look at, again, humans as our first example. So our energy source is food, right? So how do we get energy from food? Well, the potential energy that is stored in the chemical bonds are the potential energy that's stored within the chemical bonds of food, right? So whether it be proteins, carbohydrates, and fats of the foods we consume is liberated during digestion and cellular respiration. Alright, so these two processes allow us to harness the energy from food, right? And that energy comes in the form of stored potential energy that is stored within the chemical bonds of the foods that we consume. Alright, so that's our energy source. So let's look at another organism, right? So let's look at plants. The energy source of plants is sunlight, right? Hence why, like we mentioned over here, that plants move towards the source of light because that's their energy source, right? And it makes sense for them to want to be closer to as close as possible as the energy source. So again, so sunlight is their source of energy. And so plants use sunlight to produce sugar, right, in the form of glucose, which is what we obviously consume as well, right? And the process that converts sunlight to sugar is known as photosynthesis. So as you can see, regardless of organism, there needs to be an energy source for it to be able to carry out the other 7 functions, and the energy source will vary depending upon the organism. For us, obviously, it's food. For plants, for example, it's sunlight. For bacteria, it could be you have cyanobacteria, which use sunlight as well, and then you can also have bacteria that consumes food, inorganic materials, and so on and so forth. So the source of energy can vary, but again, there needs to be the ability to harness energy in order for an organism to be living, right? And then last but not least, number 5, at least for part 1 of this video, or part 1 of lecture 1, is the ability to grow and develop. Okay? So, again, this is another thing that aids in survival of the individual. Right? And then by using the energy that we harness, and with help of our genes, organisms, and like us, organisms are able to undergo cellular growth and development, right? So they're able to undergo cellular growth and development. Right? So that's important. So again, it goes to show once again that again, you need to be able to harness energy in order for you to really do anything, right? So for an organism to really partake in any of the other functions, it needs to be able to harness that energy. And then again, with the help of the genes that are present within the genetic code, within its DNA, then they're able to undergo cellular growth and development. And the other thing is also because genes play a role in growth, right? In growth and development, because the genetic code is sort of the roadmap, or not necessarily the roadmap, but well, yeah, I guess you could say it's the map to the individual, right? It's the directions to creating that individual organism. And so because these our genetics our genes come from our parents, or any organism's genes comes from its parents, the individual is also able to exhibit many of the same characteristics as its parents. So as it grows, so again, as the organism grows, and develops, it'll exhibit many of the same features and characteristics as its parents, right? Because the genetic code comes from the parents, right? The parents give the whole part of reproduction is passing on those genes. And so by using the energy from the environment or from whatever source, and then using the genes that come along that have been given to the organism by the parents, it's then able to undergo cellular growth and development, and then ultimately it will exhibit many of the characteristics and the features of the parents themselves, because again, the genes came from the parents, right? The other big thing, and kind of our segue into part 2 of lecture 1, or the part 2 of lecture 1 video, is that growth and development also helps the organism reach reproductive maturation, right? By being able to grow and by being able to develop, you will ultimately reach the age, or the age at which the individual can then reproduce and then carry on the species and carry on the genes, right, to the next generation. And that we'll get to. When we get to that, we'll talk about those were let's see, where was that? These 3 other characteristics which aid in species survival, we'll get to in part 2 of lecture 1. Hey guys, welcome to the Forum for Learning and to part 2 of lecture 1. In this video, we're going to continue where we left off in part 1 of lecture 1 by finishing off discussing or answering the question, what constitutes life? And then we're going to finish off this video by discussing sort of how we classify life on Earth. So without further ado, let's get started. So like I mentioned before, in part 1 of lecture 1, we started discussing sort of the 8 characteristics that all living things share. We sort of divided those 8 characteristics into characteristics that aid primarily in survival of the individual, and characteristics that aid in survival of the species. So in part 1 of lecture 1, we discussed those characteristics that aid primarily in individual survival, and there were 5 of those. And in this video, we're going to cover the remaining 3 characteristics sort of that primarily aid in survival of the species. So let's get started. So at number 6, we have the Okay. So number 6, we have the ability to reproduce. the ability to reproduce obviously aids in species survival, right? And when we talk about the ability to reproduce, we have to talk about sort of the two main ways in which organisms reproduce, and that is through asexual reproduction and through sexual reproduction. So what is asexual reproduction? So asexual reproduction is reproduction that occurs without the union of individuals, right? So it's reproduction without the union of individuals. So this means that because there's no union of individuals, you're only going to have a single parent, right? Because there's no union. So there's only going to be one parent. And so the caveat, or rather the corollary to that, is the offspring is going to contain genetic material that is identical to the parent, right? And that kind of makes sense considering that it's reproduction without the union of individuals, right? So that means there's only a single parent. The single parent is going to produce offspring, and because there's only a single parent and only a single source of genetic information, you're only going to have, or rather, you're going to have the offspring have the same exact genetic makeup as that of the parent. So asexual reproduction actually doesn't confer a great degree of diversity, right, with respect to the offspring, or genetic diversity, because again, it's just the parent gives the exact genetic sort of material, or the exact genetic makeup to that of the offspring, right? So there's no sort of novel genes that arise, or sort of any sort of diversity with respect to the offspring and the populations to follow, like the second generation of populations and so on and so forth. So there's a low degree of diversity, I should say, genetic diversity. Diversity. Right? Okay, so the other form of reproduction we mentioned was, hold on a second, okay, was sexual reproduction, right? Now, sexual reproduction is reproduction that occurs with the union of individuals. So, reproduction with the union of individuals. Right? And so here we're going to have two parents. And because there's going to be two parents, the offspring is going to have a combination of genes from both parents. So because there's multiple parents, right, there's two parents, the offspring will have a combination of genes from both parents. And so now there is going to be a greater degree of genetic diversity. So for example, if you guys have any siblings, even though you guys both have the same parents, right, and sort of the same genetic makeup that makes up your genes comes, and your siblings' genes comes from the same pool, right? The pool being the genes of both your mom and your dad. So even though the parents are the same, for example, you contain slightly different genes or slightly different characteristics than that of your siblings, right? And the reason for that is because, again, there's a combination of genes from your parents, and so it's not identical. And so the offspring is not identical like it would be if we were to have undergone asexual reproduction, right? So for asexual reproduction, you have actually, so a good sort of an example of an organism that undergoes asexual reproduction is bacteria. So an example of that. And then an example of, obviously, organisms that undergo sexual reproduction are humans, right? Okay. So those are the two main sort of types of reproduction that occurs in terms of all the organisms on Earth. Now, an important thing to note is that, excuse me, regardless of the type of reproduction, the main goal of reproduction is to pass on genes, right? Is to pass on genes to the next generation. Like, that's the ultimate goal, right? So the ability to reproduce just sort of ensures that you have the ability from one generation of organisms to the next to pass on that genetic information. It also helps to ensure that the offspring, right, will be at the same species as that of the parent, right? Because the genetic material, the genetic makeup is going to be similar, or exactly the same, like in the case of asexual reproduction, but it ensures that the offspring will be of the same species as that of the parent, and also that the offspring is going to exhibit the exact same with respect to asexual reproduction, or similar with respect to sexual reproduction characteristics to that of the parent. Okay, so that was the ability to reproduce. So the next one we have is the ability to evolve. Okay, so again, this is another characteristic that aids in species survival. Okay, so what is evolution? Well, evolution is something that occurs as a result of mutations in individuals of populations over time, right? So it's something that, so evolution is something that occurs as a result of mutations in individuals of a population over time. So there's three main qualities of evolution, right, or characteristics of evolution, and that is that it occurs as a result of mutations, and mutations just are random changes in genetic material, right? And so it's random changes, okay, that occurs in individuals of populations and over time. So it's, again, evolution occurs because of mutations, and mutations are random changes, which means that an individual cannot just choose to evolve one day, right? Like an organism can't just wake up one day and be like, oh, you know what, I'm going to decide to evolve. It doesn't happen like that, because, again, these changes in genetic material happen randomly, right? And so that's one thing. Number two is that it happens in individuals of populations. So here the important thing is that populations evolve, not individuals, right? So it's populations that evolve and not individuals. And the other thing is that it happens over time, which means that evolution is a gradual process, right? So it happens over time. It happens over the course of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So those three characteristics are very important when talking about evolution, in that it occurs as a result of mutations that takes place in individuals of populations, and it happens over time, right? So now another thing that when we talk about evolution, you guys have probably heard about is natural selection. And so evolution is very much guided. Actually, let me write this way. Is guided by natural selection. And the reason for this is because, well, natural selection is just the idea that, so let's define that. So natural selection is the idea that nature selects, right? Selects for individuals better suited, or selects for the individuals that are better suited for an environment, for a given over those that are not. Right? And it does this, or rather nature does this by giving better, or not by giving, rather it's by allowing for greater survival and reproductive success to the individuals that are better fit for the environment. So that's what natural selection is. It's just that nature will select for the individuals that are better suited for an environment over those that are not, simply by allowing them to have greater survival and reproductive success, right? So, and it kind of goes in hand with evolution, right? Because the process of natural selection occurs, or rather nature is able to select for individuals as a result of those mutations that occur in individuals, which confers them better, making them better fit, for example, for that environment, right? So evolution is guided by natural selection, and again, natural selection is just the idea that nature selects for individuals that are better suited for an environment over those that aren't, by allowing for greater survival and reproductive success. Okay, so that was excuse me, that was evolution. So now let's discuss the last one. So we're on number 8 now, which is the ability to adapt. Again, this is another characteristic that aids in the survival of the species. So right? And the other thing is also, well, okay, so we said that the ability to adapt. What do we mean by that? Well, first let's define what an adaptation is, right? That would be the first thing to do. Adaptation. So what is an adaptation? Well, an adaptation is just a characteristic, right, that is necessary to be able to survive and reproduce in a given environment, right? So it's the right the right set characteristics necessary for survival and reproductive success success in a given environment, right? So that's what an adaptation is. Now again, the ability to adapt also goes hand in hand with evolution, right? Because in evolution, through natural selection, or rather, evolution through natural selection gives rise to individuals that are better fit for an environment over those that are not. And this ability to be fit for an environment is pretty much based off whether or not the individual has the right set of adaptations necessary to have the survival and reproductive success in a given environment. So it kind of all sort of ties in together with evolution, natural selection, and adaptation in that, again, so let's write this down. So evolution by way of natural selection, right? So by way of natural selection gives rise, so evolution gives rise to individuals that are more fit, right? That are fit for a given, or fit for a given environment. And when we talk about being fit for a given environment, it just means that that the organism has the right adaptations to be able to survive and reproduce in that specific environment. Right? So again, being fit just simply means the organism has those adaptations, the right characteristics that are necessary to then confer survival and reproductive success in that given environment. So now, something important to note is that we keep talking about how adaptation is related to the environment, right? So, for example, the right adaptations necessary to survive in the ocean is going to be different from the adaptations necessary to survive on land, right? So, for example, fish have gills, whereas we breathe through our noses, right? So depending on the environment, the adaptations necessary for survival will also be dependent, right? Or will also be different. Again, it's all based on the environment, which means that adaptations are not constant. They are not constant, right? And the reason for that is, well, if the environment changes, so will the adaptations necessary to survive, right? So, for example, let's say, you have you have a piece of land that then gets flooded, and then you have, or rather, like, let's say you have like a lake, right, where you have fish, and the adaptations necessary to survive will be that of an aquatic environment, right? And then let's say the lake dries up over, obviously, thousands of years. The lake dries up and then becomes land, and so now the adaptations necessary to survive in that environment is going to be different from when it was a lake, right? So adaptations are not constant. So as the environment changes, so will the adaptations necessary for survival and reproductive success. Okay, so let's talk about sort of an example that ties in all of this together, right? That ties in the ability to reproduce, the ability to evolve, and obviously the ability to adapt. So let's say let's say that, we have a petri dish here, okay? We have a petri dish here, and we have, let's say, bacteria in it, right? So let's say we start off with, a single colony of bacteria, right? And then we let the bacteria reproduce over the course of, let's say, 10 days or so. And so now we're going to end up having, again, a petri dish. But in this case, let's say we have these bacteria have reproduced, and then we have 10, let's say we have 10 new colonies, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. Now, again, this multiplication that's happening here, right, is asexual reproduction, right? Because again, bacteria undergo asexual reproduction. Okay, so we have a petri dish that we start off, and it's just a petri dish, right? With agar, and that's it. And obviously the nutrients needed for the bacteria to survive. And we go from one sort of colony to about 10, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so again, because bacteria undergo asexual reproduction, majority of the individuals in this colony here is going to contain identical genetic information to that of the colony, the original colony, right? Because asexual reproduction just means that, or the corollary of asexual reproduction is that the offspring will be identical to that of the parent, will have the identical genetic makeup of that of the parent. Now, of course, let's say that, the chance for mutations still exists, right? So there's, again, mutations being those random changes in hereditary material, that can still happen, right? Even if it's with asexual reproduction, obviously the chances are much lower because you're just dividing and making identical offspring, right? So let's say that, we have, let's say 10% of the individuals, right? So we'll do right here. We'll have 10% of the individuals, let's say, have some sort of mutation that gives them the ability to be to have the antibiotic resistant gene, right? So let's take one of these guys out, and we'll put a red dot on it, right? So let's say that out of these 10 colonies, one of the colonies has individuals that contain the antibiotic resistant gene, and that antibiotic resistant gene came about through just random changes in hereditary material, or better known as mutations, right? Oops. So, okay. So we have the rest of the colonies have the exact same genetic makeup as that of the parent, and originally the parents did not, or the parent colony does not contain any antibiotic resistant gene. Okay, so we talked about asexual reproduction, we talked about mutations, right? So now let's say what happens. Let's say that we go from, okay, so let's say that now, so let's say we have, right? So we have, let's say we have those 10. Right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we have our little colony of antibiotic resistant gene containing bacteria. And so now let's say that we introduce antibiotics to this petri dish, right? So let's say that, so we have, again, let's go back to this blue. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we have the antibiotic resistant one. Okay, so now let's say we, again, like I said, we add in, say, we added in the antibiotic. We added some sort of antibiotic to this petri dish, right? So it could be penicillin, ampicillin, whatever. It doesn't really matter. So we'll just go with white. So let's say we add in, right? So in this petri dish we have antibiotics administered, right? I know it's white. I know it's kind of like a weird color for antibiotics, but it's fine. I guess it'll do for now. So here, so this transition here, we said what was asexual reproduction, right? Because the colony grew, as well as mutation and mutations, right? Because the mutations gave rise to that colony that contains this antibiotic resistant gene. So now here, what happens is, here is the change in environment, right? Because initially we didn't have any antibiotics, whereas now we have antibiotics. So what does that mean? Well, that means that now in order to have survival and reproductive success, an organism is going to need to have this antibiotic resistant gene, right? So this is going after the ability to adapt, as well as sort of the ability to evolve, because now that the environment has changed, right? So the environment here has changed, and so which means that the adaptations also have to change, right? So the adaptation necessary to survive in this environment here is going to be different from that of this right here. Over here, there was not a great deal of adaptations necessary to survive, right? Whereas over here, the adaptation necessary is going to be that antibiotic resistant gene. Now this is the adaptation, or the right adaptation, right? And the reason it's the right adaptation is because we've introduced that's antibiotics right here, right? So this is So we've changed the environment by adding the antibiotics, and because of that, the adaptations necessary to survive will also have to be different. And in this case, in this environment here, it's the antibiotic resistant gene. So all of the organisms that, or all of the bacteria that don't have it, are going to start dying off, right? So here, let's draw this again. So now what's going to happen is, so we have say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we have 10, right? And now over here, what's happening in this arrow here? Well, here we have natural selection. And what do we mean by that? Well, again, because we have antibiotics in this petri dish, all the bacteria that don't contain the antibiotic resistant gene is going to start dying off, because they have significantly less survival and reproductive success, right? Because they no longer have the right adaptation to have survival and reproductive success, and so they're going to start dying off. So what's going to happen is this new petri dish, or rather the petri dish after we've administered antibiotics, is just going to have that one colony of the bacteria that contain the antibiotic resistant gene. So we still have the antibiotics here, right? And so now what's going to happen to the next 10 times of reproduction? We're going to have, let's draw this again, right? So we still have our antibiotics and so on. But now we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now we have 10 colonies again, but of those bacteria of those bacteria that contain the antibiotic resistant gene. So let's go through this one more time. I know it was kind of messy because we were still drawing it out, right? So first we have, let's go back to green. Okay. So first, right here, we have just a petri dish with a single colony of bacteria that do not have the antibiotic-resistant gene, right? So now, after undergoing asexual reproduction, 10 cycles of that, and chance mutations occurring, we have 9 colonies of bacteria that are identical to that of the parent population, and one colony of bacteria, or one colony of bacteria that contain the antibiotic resistant gene, right? So those are the ones that have undergone mutations during their reproductive cycle. And when we say like one colony, it's just to show that 10% of the bacteria contain that gene, right? It's not always going to be this organized. Okay, so now again, originally we just had agar and the nutrients and a fairly stable environment, so the adaptations necessary to survive weren't that stringent. But now we change the environment, right? We change the environment, and if the environment changes, the adaptations necessary to survive in that environment also changes, which gives rise to our antibiotic, gives rise to the significance of our antibiotic resistant gene, because we've introduced this antibiotics to this petri dish, the adaptation necessary to have survival and reproductive success has also changed, and that adaptation that's going to confer survival and reproductive success now in this new environment is the antibiotic resistant gene. So those individuals that don't have it, meaning those are the individuals that are not as fit for this new environment, right? So what's going to happen? You're going to have natural selection, or nature, right, selecting for the individuals with the right adaptations, which are these guys here, over those that don't have it, which are those, right, which are the ones that are not fit, whereas this is more fit than the other ones. So what's going to happen here? Well, what's going to happen is that, again, we're going to go from having all these different colonies to just this. So here we have again natural selection happening, because nature is going to select against those individuals that don't contain the right adaptation, which is that antibiotic resistant gene, and it's going to select for the individuals that do contain that right adaptation, that gene of antibiotic confers antibiotic resistance, right? And so what's going to happen now? Again, you undergo another 10 cycles, say, of asexual reproduction. You're going to end up now having a colony, or all the colonies containing only that antibiotic resistant gene. You're not gonna have any individuals that contain or that don't have that gene, because the environment forces selection pressures, which results in only the individuals that are better fit for the environment to survive, to have survival and reproductive success. So that kind of hopefully illustrates all of these remaining 3 characteristics that we discussed earlier in this video of, again, the ability to reproduce, the ability to evolve, and the ability to adapt. Okay, so that was it. So now we've kind of answered with respect to using what we learned in part 1 of lecture 1, right? We discussed those 5 characteristics, and then we finished off by discussing the remaining 3 characteristics. So now we have a better idea as to what constitutes life. So we've done that. Right, so we've talked about all the 8 different characteristics that an organism has to have in order, or that an entity has to have in order for it to be considered living. So we discussed what constitutes life. So now let's discuss sort of how do we classify life on Earth, right? So if you remember from in part 1 of lecture 1, when we discussed order, which was the first characteristic out of the 8 that we discussed, we went from the atom to the cell to the human being, right? And we mentioned that all living things on Earth have some sort of order that is surrounded by having one or more cells, right? That was what we mentioned in order. So all living things have some sort of structure consisting of one or more cells, right? And so one way to classify living things on Earth, which we, again, like we discussed in part 1 of lecture 1, is with respect to, let me actually delete this because this is we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's with respect to unicellular versus multicellular, right? We discussed that in part 1 of lecture 1, or as we talked about the examples, when we briefly talked about it. But so that's one way to organize living things on Earth. Another way to organize living things on Earth is prokaryote. Oops, hold on. 1 second. Is the prokaryote versus eukaryote discussion, right? So prokaryotes versus eukaryotes is another way to classify organisms, whether are they eukaryotic or are they prokaryotic. So what do we mean by that, right? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Okay, so we'll start with prokaryotes. So what are prokaryotes? Well, prokaryotes are organisms that lack a membrane-bound nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So prokaryotes don't have a membrane-bound nucleus and they don't have any membrane-bound organelles. They still have genetic material, so have genetic material, right? In the form of DNA, but this is not located in the nucleus because they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. They're not located in the nucleus, but instead is located in what's called the nucleoid. A nucleoid is just a central region of the cell that contains DNA, right? So prokaryotes still do have DNA, but they don't have membrane-bound organelles or a membrane-bound nucleus. So the corollary to that is that, generally speaking, because they don't have membrane-bound organelles, they're not going to have a great degree of compartmentalization, right? So they have less compartmentalization, right? Okay, so because they have less compartmentalization, they're not as efficient with respect to carrying out the cellular processes, right? Because compartmentalization of structure and function allows for greater efficiency with which to carry out these cellular processes. And because there's not as much compartmentalization with respect to prokaryotes, because they lack those membrane-bound organelles or membrane-bound nucleus, what's going to happen is most prokaryotes, prokaryotes are going to generally be unicellular or colonial organisms, right? So that prokaryotes are going to tend to be unicellular or colonial in nature, right? Because again, they don't have the compartmentalization, which means that they can't efficiently get to a larger size, and they can't efficiently get to being a multicellular organism because they don't have that compartmentalization, which ensures, which confers great efficiency. So that's what prokaryotes are. So a good example of prokaryotes are bacteria. Or actually, let me write it on this way, actually. Okay, so those are what prokaryotes are. Those are the characteristics of prokaryotes. Now, with respect to eukaryotes, so eukaryotes, they're the opposite. So they are organisms that have a membrane-bound nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Right? And so here the genetic material has genetic material in the form of DNA, and this time it's located in the nucleus. Right? So here, with respect to eukaryotes, we have a greater degree of compartmentalization, because again, we have membrane-bound organelles and membrane-bound nucleus, right? We have membrane-bound organelles and nucleus, and because of that means that they have a greater degree of compartmentalization, and because they have greater degree of compartmentalization, they have greater efficiency with which they can carry out the cellular processes, and because of that, they tend to be oops. Tend to be multicellular organisms. Now, of course, there can be exceptions, right, to this general tendency for most eukaryotes to be multicellular, and so you can have unicellular. Oops. Eukaryotes, but generally speaking, they tend to be more so multicellular. So an example, obviously, of a multicellular eukaryote is humans, right? And then an example of a unicellular eukaryote, which is much rarer, right, is yeast. So that's sort of one of the ways in which we can classify organisms, right? Whether or not they are prokaryotes or eukaryotes, similar to unicellular versus multicellular, which we discussed kind of, well, briefly when we discussed the examples in part 1 of lecture 1, we discussed order. But yeah, this is just another way of classifying organisms on Earth. Now, one of the ways to kind of remember the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is just this is kind of a cheesy scheme, but it worked for me, so I'm sure it can help you guys out. So pro, right, the word pro, the prefix pro rhymes with no, right? So pro, no, right? So prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles and no membrane-bound nucleus. So that's one way to remember. And then eukaryotes, so EU kind of rhymes with yes, right? So yes, it has that Y sound. Yes. So here, eukaryotes, they do have membrane-bound organelles and a membrane-bound nucleus. This is kind of a somewhat of a cheesy way to remember it, but if it works for you guys, then so be it, right? Okay, so that was that. So okay, so let's go back to we're almost done with this here. Yeah, we'll start here actually. So like I mentioned in part 1 of lecture 1 under the order characteristics, when we were talking about the characteristics that all living things share, we discussed order, and when we were talking about order, we went from, so when discussing order, we went from what we discussed starting with the atom, and then we made our way to the cell, and then we made our way to the human, right, or to the individual. So the atom being the fundamental unit of matter, and the cell being the fundamental unit of life, right? So we went from something as small as the atom to the cell, so the atom being the fundamental unit of matter, to the cell, which is the fundamental unit of life, and then we went to the individual, which in our case, with respect to what we were talking about, and the examples we were talking about, was the human, right? So, well, okay, so we went from something as tiny as the atom to the individual. Well, now how do we go from the individual to all the individuals on Earth, right? So that's what we're about to do now. So we'll go from the individual to pretty much to Earth, just like we did from the atom to the individual in part 1 of lecture 1, and that's going to be sort of how we wrap up this video. So let's finish it up. Okay, so we have, like I said, we have the individual, right? So we have obviously from the atom to the cell, and then finally to the individual, and then so now let's talk about the individual. So from the individual we have what's called a population. And I'll write it out first, and then we'll discuss each of them, and then we'll talk about it. We'll wrap it up by discussing an example that ties all of these in together. So we have the population, and then from the population we have what's known as the community. Okay, and then from the community we go to what is called the ecosystem, and then from the ecosystem we have the Earth, which is also known as the biosphere. Right? So that's kind of the transition from the individual to all the individuals on Earth, right? Okay, so when we talk about the individual, it could be unicellular or multicellular, or it could be a prokaryote or eukaryote, right? Prokaryote versus eukaryote, like we just discussed. It could be anything, but again, it's just an individual, right? Then we have the population. So what is the population? The population is all the individuals of a single species that's living in a specific area. Okay, that's what the population is. Okay, so what's the community? Well, the community consists of all the populations living in a specific area, right? So that's what a community is. Now an ecosystem, on the other hand, is going to consist of, so it consists of all the living and non-living things in a specific area, right? So when we talk about living, we consider that to be biotic, right? And then non-living factors are known as abiotic. And then we have the biosphere, which is just the collection of all ecosystems, or all the ecosystems on Earth, right? So that's the biospheres. So the biosphere pretty much represents all the zones of life on Earth. Okay, so let's talk about let's talk about all of these, how they relate to each other, or how, with respect to these terms, right? So the individual, population, community, ecosystem, Earth, and let's talk about an example on how all these kind of tie in together. So when we talk about the individual, let's just pick, let's say, a pine tree in a forest, right? So a specific pine tree in a specific forest or a specific area, right? So that forest is our specific area, and then that individual is our pine tree. Now, when we talk about the population, what we mean is that population is going to consist of all of the pine trees in that specific forest. So it's all of the individuals of a single species, in this case pine trees, in a specific area being the forest, right? So that's the population. So again, the individual is a pine tree in a forest. Now, the population is going to be all the pine trees living in that specific forest, okay? Now community is going to be all the pine trees, all the insects, all the animals, all the plants, all of the birds, and so on, right, in that specific forest. So again, a community is all the populations of the species of all the different species living in a specific area, right? So it's going to be all the pine trees, all the other animals, all the plants living in that specific forest, okay? Now, with respect to ecosystem, it consists of, again, all the living and non-living things in a specific area, right? So in this case, in our example, it's going to be all the pine trees, insects, animals, birds, plants, as well as all of the water, the soil, the rocks, right, the minerals, all of those things in that specific forest. So it consists of all the living and non-living things in a specific area, again, specific area being that forest, right? Now, with respect to Earth and the biosphere, again, it's just a collection of all of these ecosystems on Earth. So you go from something as small as the individual to something as huge as the whole planet, right? Alright, so I think that's it for this video. I think this is kind of a pretty long video. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So let's see if we answered part 2. So how do we classify life on Earth? Well, we discussed one way of being unicellular versus multicellular. We also discussed prokaryote versus eukaryote. And then we discussed sort of how we classify, the individual, population, and ecosystem, and community, and all of that as well. So we can check that off as well. So yeah, so that's it for this one, guys. Thank you for watching. Again, this is like one of the first few videos I've ever made on this channel. So if you guys liked it or disliked it or have any suggestions or whatever, drop a comment down below. And I'd love to hear from you guys and find ways to improve on these videos and so on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching. And as always, stay true, be kind, never stop learning. And that's pretty much it. So, okay, bye.